Hey, welcome to our final video in the series about qualitative analysis. Oh man, lockdown here is getting interesting. Okay, so today, this video, we're going to talk about three different things. I want to give you an overview of grounded theory, thematic analysis, and affinity diagramming. So those are the three kind of things that I think you'll come across most when it comes to qualitative analysis, and kind of the things that I've maybe got some experience of that we can start to compare and contrast them. And if you look back, if you ever need to use any of this, hopefully it will be useful. So, yeah, the first one that I want to do is grounded theory. I think this is the most complex one, but the idea is that you want to generate or discover a theory. That should say Glaser and Strauss, STR. I'll change it for the PDF that I upload, but Glaser and Strauss, they developed the first grounded theory method in 1967. They wrote a textbook, and from there it became something of a soap opera. They both had different ideas of what they should do going forward, and they basically split. So Strauss worked with other people, Glaser worked with other people, and developed kind of a parallel sense of what grounded theory might be. But what they both agree on is that it's a systematic process and that it's an iterative process of moving between data and having this emerging analysis. That means that when you go and collect more data, you're becoming progressively more focused until you arrive at a theory. So this is the Strauss and Corbin methods, and this is the version that I've been more kind of actively involved with. So your starting point is going to be the situation you want to explore. Now remember, you're not answering a question as such. You just want to explore a situation. So you want to explore how children interact in the classroom. You want to explore how teachers make use of technology. You want to explore how teenagers use technology on the bus. You want to explore how people make use of smart speakers in the home. So you have some starting point, which is literature in relation to that topic, and then you have some method. Now, interviews is what's on here. It doesn't need to be interviews. It can be focus groups, observations, but some data source. For interviews or like this kind of verbal interaction, you're going to need to transcribe those. And then there's this concept of memo writing. Now, memo writing is when you write down your thoughts about what's going on. You keep memos of observations that you've taken that day. And all of those things together, your interview, your memos, are put into a coding process. That coding process is iterative, so you can keep going round this cycle over and over again. But what you do is you develop some kind of theory, and at some point you develop a sufficient theory that you can stop. So there's three different types of coding within this method of grounded theory. The first is open coding, where you want to move things from a code to a concept to a category. So what you're doing there is trying to kind of conceptualize and categorize a phenomena or a theory. So you can either do that purely just with the data, or you can do it with the data and referencing technical literature, so existing theories, things that have come out of your literature review, for example. So each item, perhaps it's a sentence or a word or a thing that you observed, will be coded, and that's just like you're giving things a label. You'll then categorize those codes into concepts and then turn the concepts into like a theory of a higher order, which would be your category. The second type of coding that you might encounter is axial coding, and that's when you're investigating relationships. So you want to integrate relationships between those categories such that you can start to build a framework. So that framework is kind of answering questions like, how do the categories influence each other? How, let's take our teenagers with technology in the bus. How does the length of the bus route influence, right? So you're starting to come up with questions and relate them to how your pieces of data relate to one another. Following that, you're trying to create one cohesive theory with selective coding. So you take your categories that you have, you combine them together using your axial coding, which is your relationships, and then you are selective such that you create one theory that answers a question, what is going on? And once you have kind of one idea, then you're done. You've got your theory. So that is grounded theory as a method. If you want to see it in action, you can. I'm just looking for my timer. I found it. If you want to see it in action, you can download this paper, which is looking at designing an authoring tool so that you can create social stories for kids with autism, or comics for kids with autism. So this is an idea of taking all these multiple data sources and combining them together to make one theory, which can then inform the design. Okay, that's grounded theory. Thematic analysis is a way of identifying concepts or themes and backing up these assertions that you have with data. So you encode all the data and then you identify the meaning by interpreting all of those codes that you've created. So again, you've got individual pieces of data, excerpts from interview, sentences from interview, observation instances, and you tag them with labels or codes, and then you iteratively combine them to get an overview. Now, the key difference between this and grounded theory is that in thematic analysis, you have a research question that you're trying to answer. So you have kind of a direction, a path that you're working towards. So it will look something like this. This is just one example. This might be my transcript. So I have a list of my participants. I've got line numbers. This is just helpful once it gets complicated. I can always return to that particular transcript. I've got time. I know exactly what was said and what was done at each instance. So generating that transcript takes a lot of time. At the beginning, maybe 5 times the length of the transcript to create that, to put all the information in. And there's a lot more systems that will automate that for you in terms of it will try and generate the transcript from the audio, but you've still got to do all this tidying up. And often if it's from a video transcription takes much longer because you also have to tag actions as well, which you can't see when you just have audio transcription. So they do take a long time to do. Once you have that, you've got something that kind of looks like this. So you've got A, B, and AC, who are our participants in this discussion. And there's a bit of back and forth. And the highlighted areas are linked to codes. So there's increased maturity, there's increased self-confidence, and maybe the one at the bottom hasn't been tagged. But you're starting to put something alongside these. Now, you can either do this manually, where you have effectively post-it note type things to do it. You can also do it using online systems. So there's a system called InVivo that does it. There's a whole bunch of other ones that I've not used. But you can tag things and then you can kind of look at the tag and it'll highlight everything related to that tag and so on. So it is a very kind of two-way system. So I've got some tags. So those tags are my codes. They are those black dots at the top. And what I want to do is, similar to grounded theory, I want to combine them into categories. So I want to make larger groups of data and meaning. And then I want to group them into themes so that I represent kind of some kind of pattern within the data. And it's those themes that are going to contribute to answering my research question. So the first thing I need to do is become familiar with my data. So I need to read my transcripts again. I might have been in the interview, I might have transcribed them, but it's maybe not fresh in my mind, so I have to read them all before I start. And then I start with these initial codes, which I'll generate around a research question, and I can combine them and reduce them as I go. Once I've got that, we start an iterative process. So I will then combine all the codes into categories, and I need to generate a description for each label. So if I have a category called device, I have to put in there the technology being used by the active individual or something like this, some description, so that if someone else comes along and I say, take all of these bits of data and apply those categories to them or those codes to them, they need a definition to work from. They need a set of rules that they can use to apply. So we generate the description. Then we review all of those categories and we do the iterative thing again and we get to themes. Again, they've got a label and a theme, and at that point you draw a thematic map, which is really just looks like a mind map, showing how your themes and categories are combined together to generate an overall picture. Once you have that thematic map, you want to go back and do something called member checking. And member checking is when you take your original codes and you see whether or not they apply to the themes as you've described them. So do your themes make sense when you go back down 2 levels to your original data? So it's a very flexible implementation, and that's great, right? But because you can have input from multiple researchers to do it, you can have input from large data sets, but there are issues with time. It takes a long time to do. It's a very repetitive process. Generally, however, what you find is people who are doing this kind of process have an interest in the underlying data. So it's not like you're kind of banging your head off a brick wall to get it complete. Although it's long, it is usually interesting. The one challenge that does exist, however, is reliability. So if I have multiple people coding data, how do I know that they're consistently coding data? So the way that you can do that is you can, and how do I know that I am consistent in coding my data, right? How do I know that I am coding the same things in the same way today that I did yesterday and that I did the day before? Has my kind of internal definition of those descriptors for categories, have they changed? Or how do I know? I probably don't know because I'm in that process. So you can take sections or maybe 10%, maybe a set number, and you can ask other people to code them based on the descriptions and definitions. And from that, you can calculate an agreement percentage. And if the agreement percentage is sufficiently high, then there's consistency, and you can check that consistency between individuals or between a person on a given day. It's not used in all cases, but if you're mainly because it's got this flexible implementation, it's not always needed, but it's a valuable way of reducing the subjectivity. It's a valuable way of reducing opinion because you know that people's opinions are cohesive. So that is thematic analysis. Affinity diagramming, this is probably my favourite one just because of the kind of rapid turnover that we have with it. So the history is that out of some total quality control research in Japan, they created some tools that would help people within business, right? And some of them you've seen: prioritization matrix, process charts, interrelationships, tree diagram or hierarchies. But one that we often see and have definitely used through school, I would say, is affinity diagramming. So affinity diagramming is often used for project management or brainstorming in particular, where you're generating lots of ideas and combining them. It's also a method of contextual inquiry. So it's taking all of the information that I have and putting it into a broader context of the project or the research that I'm doing. So it's a bottom-up process. So I'm starting with all of those small parts of data and I'm working towards a question or a research topic in the same way that I am with thematic analysis. I have a question that I'm addressing, and that question that I'm addressing is kind of the important thing. So I'm creating a meaningful structure for large volumes of data that are typically gathered through qualitative methods. So surveys, interviews, case studies, diaries, observations, whatever it is. And so the fact that it's bottom up and starting with that data means that it holds all the same advantages as the other methods. It's lightweight, it doesn't take very long, and I just enjoy the physical interaction with the data. I like having lots of post-its or bits of paper and moving them around because I'm a visual thinker. It appeals to me much more than just reading through transcripts after transcripts. And I like that there's team effort and discussion within there, so you can kind of resolve any subjectivity as you go along. Although the creation of the final thing is perhaps subject to the group dynamic, it means that there is some inherent consideration of subjectivity within that process. And I think the fact that you can kind of see everything at once, you can tie them back to data, to participants, to observations. It's just a nice kind of overall package in terms of convenience, for me anyway, in terms of how I operate. So how does it happen? You have your transcription or your note taking, so this is your data, and then you identify affinity notes. So the researcher would go through and do this. This is perhaps the most subjective area of this process, and what I have done in the past is have people take a subset of my data and also identify affinity notes to see whether we've identified the same things, the same topics. And I've also had multiple people do it and only use the things that we both code as interesting so that there's consistency. So there's lots of ways you can do that. But these are the things that you would code. The things that you would highlight within thematic analysis are probably interesting. So you have to make sure that you condense it to an essence that is quickly read and understood. You don't want to have big paragraphs worth of stuff, but obviously it has to make sense out of context. And then you randomly split all of these extracts into two groups. You get a bunch of participants who will arrange 50% of them into a map, and then I have me, the researcher, and my team, we'll arrange the other 50%. I prefer it when I have a team, just because of that group subjectivity dynamic. So your participants, you need to choose them wisely. I was a participant in an Affinity Diagramming group when there was two really strong characters and they just could not agree on anything. They both just kind of wanted to be right, to be correct. So that was a really difficult time for the facilitator, and the role of the facilitator is really important because you have to be able to move people along. You have to be able to help people, to remind them of the research question, perhaps. So what I do is I always kind of have that on the wall, like a big poster type thing with the research question, or on the desk if it's a desk-based activity. And then the other thing that participants need to do is make sure that all the groups they create are labelled. So when you gather a bunch of post-it notes together, encourage them to make sure there's a label on the table, that they can see what that group represents, because otherwise you end up with just kind of feature creep, expansion creep, that kind of thing. The group that you've created means all things to all people. So having a label and a description is helpful, although not always required straight away. But something to pinpoint, this pile of things is about this topic. And then I'll come along, I can make adjustments to the existing map based on the new information that's coming in. So we end up with a structure that kind of looks like this, where we have a super header, which is kind of like my main topics, and then I have categories underneath, and then codes. So what you might see is like this purple one is my theme, the blue ones are my categories, and the yellow ones are the code, if you were mapping it to a thematic analysis. In practice, it looks kind of like this. This is me with some survey responses that I've just printed out and cut them up. Cut up the interesting parts of them, and then you can see I've got kind of post-its on top, and they are my labels. I then take all of those labels and I draw them into an affinity map. So in this case, I've got kind of like four main topics I've kind of circled in red, and then this is how everything else fits around them. So I end up basically with something that looks like this. So this is one part of that map that I've drawn. And each of those sections about relying on others, collaboration, being a single modality, these are all things that have data points that I can link to so that I can discuss each of those kind of white circles can be discussed individually, and together they relate to the central concept of a lack of accessibility. So that is the end of our overview of the three methods. Hopefully you can compare and contrast them. The affinity diagramming is the one that we are going to do in person. So when I see you next week, we'll have a go at that, and it'll be interesting to see how we manage that online. So we're not going to have, obviously, bits of paper. We're going to use an online whiteboard to do that. So I'll see you next week.